In this video, I just want to give you a big picture understanding of how Studicata bar review works. In future videos, we'll get into more of the details of how to actually use the program and how to navigate through everything. Here, we just want to focus again on the big picture stuff, kind of why we're doing certain things the way that we're doing them. Because at Studicata, obviously, we do certain things very differently from other programs that are out there. So we do want to kind of explain why we're doing these things. Obviously, we're not just being different for the sake of being different. We do want to show you some of the methodology because it is going to be important in order to have success with Studicata bar review that the program is used as it's intended. So hopefully in this video I can just shed some light on some of our methodology so we can all be on the same page. But I guess the best place to start here when we're thinking about the bar exam is what it's all about, right? And you'll see up here on the board we have it's all about the points, right? If you're ever wondering, why Studicata bar review is structured the way it is or why you're doing something a certain way, the answer is always going to be right here. It's all about the points, right? When Studicata, or when I look at the bar exam, or when we here at Studicata look at the bar exam, we don't see a bunch of law, the performance test, the essay exam, fact patterns. Principally, what we see before any of that other stuff is opportunities to accumulate points, right? Whether you're on the performance test, you're on the essay exam, you're on the multiple choice portion, wherever you are, each fact pattern, each task that you are completing is an opportunity to accumulate points, right? Because that's how you pass the bar exam, right? It's all about accumulating points in the allotted time that you have. So at Studicata, the way that we look at everything, anytime we're assigning activities or we're doing anything, even this video itself, right? Everything is a measure of ROI, right? Everything we're looking at is your ROI from that activity with the investment, right? ROI standing for return on investment, right? And your investment here being time, right? So everything that we're looking at is time versus point yield, right? This is our formula. It's time versus point yield. This is how everything works. I'm constantly weighing the time that you spend in any bar exam preparation activity against the potential point yield. Because obviously we want to have a very high or effective ROI. We want every minute that you spend to be very valuable in returning you, right? When we're thinking about return on investment, points, right? You're trading time in bar exam preparation for point yield, right, on the bar exam, because you want to accumulate enough points to pass, right? So the answer to everything is right here, right? It's all about ROI. We want to maximize your time in bar exam preparation on areas that are going to result in point yield on the bar exam, right? So if you're wondering why something is structured the way it is or why we're doing one thing this way and a different company is doing it that way, right, we're doing this all based on point accumulation. And to a lot of degree, right, I don't even necessarily care whether you fully understand why everything works the way it does or why one law kind of operates this way or why you should write an essay in a certain format, right? A lot of that doesn't matter as long as you're accumulating the points, right? Because that's what it's all about. We're here to learn how to pass the bar exam, which is all about the points. We're not here to learn how to be a lawyer, how to practice law effectively, any of that stuff. Really, you're going to learn how to be a lawyer after you get past the bar exam and you start practicing law. We're not worried about that at all at Studicata bar review. What we're worried about is whether or not you're going to pass the bar exam. And that comes down to point accumulation, right? So that's kind of the overview of what the overall strategy is. So when you start to view the bar exam though, like we do in terms of points, right, as the bar exam being a big opportunity to accumulate points and really nothing else, when you start viewing it in that frame of mind, I think it's going to shed a lot of light on why we do things a certain way here at Studicata bar review. For instance, right, one of the core tenets you're going to see here, and we talk about this a lot, is always doing practice questions under bar exam conditions, right? So anytime you do a practice set here at Studicata, whether it's a performance test, whether it's a practice MEE essay, or it's a practice MBE multiple choice question, we're going to recommend that you always do those practice question sets under bar exam conditions, meaning no notes in front of you that wouldn't be available on the bar exam, and under time conditions. So if you have 30 minutes to write an essay on the bar exam, we want you to only spend 30 minutes writing your essay on practice, right? If you have 3 hours to answer 100 questions on the multiple choice portion, we want to matriculate that down to each individual question, meaning you have 1 minute and 48 seconds to answer each question during practice, right? Same with the performance test, right? So the idea here being, and don't worry about the exact times, we'll lay all that out for you as you go through the schedule. The main idea here being, though, we always want you to do practice questions, closed book, right, without any resources that wouldn't be available to you on the actual bar exam, and under time conditions, what we call under bar exam conditions, right? And the question here is, well, why? Why do we want to do it like that? Well, again, if we think about it in terms of ROI, right? Your time spent studying versus potential point yield. What's your return on the time you spend studying? Right, well, what is the worst thing that you can possibly do on the bar exam? If we're thinking about the bar exam, it's nothing but accumulating points, right? By definition, then what becomes the absolute worst thing you can do on the bar exam? What's the only way that you guarantee that you accumulate a goose egg, 0 points on the exam? How do you, if you're sitting there looking at the test, guarantee that you get no points? Right, well, the only way is to leave stuff blank, right? You don't finish, right? Either you leave an essay blank, or you leave multiple choice questions blank, or you don't finish the performance test. Obviously, most students don't leave multiple choice questions blank, but even if you get to the end and you have 10 left unanswered and you write C for each one real quick, that's still not an optimal result either, right? I would still consider that not really finishing, even though you just bubbled C for everything, right? So if that's the worst thing that you can do, then by definition, those are the only ways that you guarantee yourself 0 points in different areas of the test, right? Whether that's the performance test, the essay portion, the multiple choice portion, right? And again, it's not necessarily that it's over. If you don't finish one multiple choice question, right, it's not going to make or break your exam. But if it starts getting to be a real problem where you're leaving an entire essay blank, right? Leaving an entire essay blank, by the way, just to give you some context, would be similar to leaving 20 multiple choice questions blank, right? It's a big deal. A lot of students think, if I leave one essay blank, it won't really kill me that much. It's pretty hard to come back from that. Again, it's not over, but that is like leaving 20 multiple choice questions blank. I mean, it's a significant thing. You don't want to leave essays blank. You don't want to leave anything blank, because by the way, remember, by definition, if it's all about the points, it's all about accumulating points, then the worst thing you can do on the bar exam is not finish, right? That's the only way you actually guarantee 0 points on any area of the test. So when you're asking, well, why do we always practice under bar exam conditions? Well, it's to avoid the worst case scenario in the bar exam. It's to avoid a 0 point yield return on your time, right? Remember, it always comes back to this formula. We do not want any of our bar takers at Studicata to leave questions blank, because that statistically is the worst thing you can do, right? There's nothing worse than somebody failing the bar exam, not because they don't know the law well enough, but because they don't have the proper time management skills, right? They knew all the law well enough, should have passed, but they just left some stuff blank, and in the end that cost them. That's a really terrible result, and we want to avoid that from day one. So again, we're going to recommend that you always practice under bar exam conditions, so that from day one, you're building that internal clock, right? You're going to hear me talk about the internal clock a lot. The reason is, right, when you do enough practice questions under bar exam conditions, right, where you're constantly looking at that timer, that clock in front of you, something's going to happen after you do this enough, right? You start to build an internal clock where you don't even have to see the clock anymore, right, to know how you're doing on time, right? You're going to know once you've done, 30, 60, whatever it is, practice essays each day for weeks, under a 30-minute clock, you're going to start to really know that pace that you have to move at to write a finished essay really well. After weeks of doing practice, under timed conditions, that internal clock's going to get very accurate. You're going to start to know exactly what 30 minutes on an essay feels like. Same thing on the multiple choice questions, right? You're going to know when you work through sets over and over again with that timer right in front of you, you're going to know when it feels like you've spent too long on a question and it's time to move on. You're going to have that internal clock. You're going to know when you have some extra time where maybe you can spend a little bit longer thinking about one question that's giving you trouble, right? That's only going to be built by practicing a lot under bar exam conditions, right? And I know the response to this though is, okay, so from day one, we're always going to recommend that you're doing everything under bar exam conditions. No notes, no time, or always having a timer in front of you. What about building confidence, right? Oftentimes the response is from other bar review companies, well, look, in the very beginning, we want students to crawl before they walk, right? We want them to build up confidence, to see how to write that perfect essay, to take as much time as they need to really build their confidence. And then once they have a better base, the foundation, that confidence is built up, then we'll start to remove the time constraints, right? So what about building confidence? Well, number one, right, the first response to this is, well, essentially, you might be building confidence, but it's a false sense of confidence, right? Just because you can write a perfect essay in 3 hours with a bunch of notes in front of you, that doesn't mean anything, right? If you can do that, that doesn't mean you're going to be able to pass the bar exam. Probably anybody can do that, right? If you have infinite time and infinite resources, most people out there can probably write really high quality essays, right? So being able to do that, sure, it might build confidence, but it's a false sense of confidence. And I guess you could say, well, maybe the placebo effect is real, so there is some placebo effect added there. But even still, what's going to happen, even if there is some small placebo effect, you have a false sense of confidence, right? Well, what's going to happen when eventually you remove the time constraints or the bar exam conditions? Because eventually, right, what's going to happen? In these other bar review programs, eventually you have to start practicing under bar exam conditions, whether that's week 2, week 3, week 4, or even at the very end of bar review, like I've seen with a lot of students where you kind of just at the very end start rushing it in and trying to do questions under bar exam conditions, even though you didn't do that the entire time. Right, well, what's going to happen to a student's confidence when they've been practicing without bar exam conditions and then you add them in halfway through bar exam preparation? From my experience, that's actually going to hurt the student's confidence, right? Because what's going to happen? You're going to be doing really well. Imagine you're doing a bunch of multiple choice question sets without a timer, right? And you're scoring 60, 70% consistently. Well, then 3-4 weeks later, you start adding in the timer and your scores start to drop, right? You might not immediately correlate that to the adding of the timer, right? That addition of the timer. You're just going to see halfway through bar exam preparation, scores starting to get worse, right? Generally, that's not going to help confidence either. So rather than dealing with this and risking the chance of building bad habits, right? Because essentially that's what you do. If in the beginning you're doing practice questions and you're not doing them under bar exam conditions, you really risk building bad habits, right? Where if you get used to having notes in front of you or not having time limits, you're going to get used to working very slow, right? You're not going to have that pace. It's going to be hard then, once you have that habit built of taking your time, to add in the timer, right? So you got to weigh the possible gain of building some amount of confidence against the risk of building bad habits, and also that confidence actually really being a false sense of confidence, where maybe you're getting some placebo effect, but inevitably, right, you're going to have to do it under bar exam conditions. What's going to happen to the confidence then? All a long way of saying, why do we recommend that students do practice questions under bar exam conditions from day one? Well, it's all about the points, right? We think that that's a better ROI on your time, right? We think you're going to get more potential point yield on the actual exam by doing all your questions under bar exam conditions from day one, right? Again, it's all about the points. All right, so that brings us to point number 2, something else in Studicata bar review that we really focus on heavily, and in other programs I think they do this to some degree, but it's a core focus for us here at Studicata bar review, and that's going to be to prioritize your study time on areas of the test that yield the most points. All right, And the why here should be very obvious, right? Again, if the test is all about points, it's all about how many points you can accumulate in an allotted amount of time, well then it would behoove you, right, during your preparation to use your study time on the areas of the test that are going to yield you the most points, right? That's just an illustration of this ratio, right? Obviously, if you have a limited amount of time to study for the test, you want to spend that time on the areas of the test that will yield you the most points. You don't want to spend 2-3 days studying some obscure area of the law that's never going to show up on the bar exam, right? Even though you might master that subject, it's not going to result in a very good or very high point yield, right? That's a terrible use of time because you're getting no point yield out of large quantities of time spent. Right? So, and oftentimes this is easier to happen than students realize, right? It's very easy, especially in some of the other bar review programs, to really get lost in the weeds, right? To really go down some paths, because, you know, it's just the nature of, if you have these study guides and outlines that are just thousands and thousands of pages of law that cover every detail and nuance of every law that could ever be tested, it's very easy to get down into the weeds on some stuff and to get into details so far, right? You don't realize you start to lose this ratio a little bit. You start going deep enough down any path, right? The time you're spending is probably not a good use where you're not getting a very high return on point yield on the actual exam. Right, so it is important to focus as much as you can and prioritize your study time on the areas of the test that yield the most points. Right, so when you're thinking about this in terms of prioritization, right, you can think about it in a lot of different ways. Number one, right, the actual portions of the test are worth different amounts, right? The MPT, the performance test, we know is 20%, the essay portion, the MEE, is 30%, and the multiple choice portion, the MBE, is worth 50%. So obviously, just between the different tests, it's obvious how to spend your study time, right? Well, obviously the MBE is worth the most. You should probably spend the most amount of time there. The MEE is in the middle, probably in the middle. You want to spend your time there. MPT is at the bottom, right? It's only 20%. Also, notably, the MPT doesn't require knowledge of substantive law to do well, so it just requires less study time anyway. So obviously, you want to prioritize the vast majority of your study time on the essay portion, the MEE, and the multi-state bar exam, right? The MBE, or multiple choice portion, right? That's where you're going to get the most point yield, right? So in terms of just the different tests are weighted differently, sure, that's one aspect of prioritization, and I think most bar review companies get that correctly. But the other areas where it gets more interesting are areas of law within the MEE and MBE, right? Subjects that are tested, and areas of law within the subjects, right? Remember, we had 7 MBE subjects that are tested on the MBE for sure, right? We had those 7 MBE subjects that you know you're getting 25 scored questions on each on the multiple choice portion. And remember, we said that those 7 MBE subjects could also show up on the essay portion. So at minimum, right, each MBE subject is worth 7.1% of your overall score, right? If the MBE is worth 50% of your score and there's 7 subjects, well, 50 divided by 7 is right about 7.1%, right? So you know at minimum each MBE subject is worth 7.1% of your overall score. If that subject showed up on the MEE, which you know at least a couple are, 2, usually sometimes even 3, could be even more, right? 4 in some cases are going to show up on the MEE, meaning those subjects are now worth upwards of 12% of your overall score, right? The MEE is worth 30%. You're going to get 6 essays. You take 30 divided by 6 essays. That means each essay is worth about 5%, right? So you know if a subject is tested on the MBE and MEE, it's worth a little bit more than 12% of your overall score, right? Meaning those 7 MBE subjects should be where you spend the most amount of your study time, right? Where you should prioritize the most, because at minimum, they're 7% of your overall score, and they could be worth up to 12% if there's overlap, right? So in terms of what subjects should you prioritize your study time on the most, right? Well, the MBE subjects should be your top priority, and then those 5 MEE only subjects that may or may not be tested on the bar exam, they could be worth 0% or 5% of your overall score, would come a little bit less in your prioritization. Right, again, that should be fairly obvious. Okay, but probably the most fascinating portion of frequency analysis is that it turns out certain areas of law within each subject are actually worth more points than others. For example, I have probably the most known illustration of this here on the board, where we say 8% of your overall score could come from 4 elements. What do we mean by this? And some of you may know what I'm talking about here, what 4 elements I'm referring to. Right, in torts, the most commonly tested area, the highest frequency area of law tested in torts is negligence, right? And negligence, we know, is pretty much just 4 elements, right? Duty, breach, causation, and damages. So the interesting thing here, again, remember, torts is going to be worth 7.1% of your overall score at minimum, right? You're going to get 25 scored questions on the MEE testing torts, right? So that's 7.1%. And we know, because the NCBE tells us, about 13 to 14 of those scored multiple choice questions are going to test negligence, right? Duty, breach, causation, damages. So 13 to 14 out of 25, little bit more than half, you could say, then about 3.5% to 4% of your overall score is coming from negligence, guaranteed, right? Because you're going to get 13 or 14 questions, scored questions in torts on the MBE testing negligence. You do the math there, it comes out to about 3.5% to 4% of your overall score comes from negligence. Now, if torts was tested on the MEE, which is pretty frequent, right? You see torts tested on the MEE almost every other year. So very frequently, torts does show up on the MEE. When torts shows up on the MEE, negligence is the most tested topic. It almost comes up every time. So if negligence was worth the majority of points on your essay, right? If negligence was the main topic on your MEE essay, right, which most of the time it is on a torts essay, right, then you're going to get probably around another 3 to 5% of your overall score added on top of the MBE. So that's how you get to 8% of your overall score could come from 4 elements: duty, breach, causation, and damages, right? One analysis, negligence, could account for 8% of your overall score. And 8% might not sound like a ton to some of you, but when you think about this in terms of the vastness of the exam, right? The exam, we say, is a mile wide and an inch deep. There's so many areas of law that could potentially be tested on the exam, and that's how you end up with these 1,000-page outlines from other bar exam companies, right? Because they're trying to show you every detail and nuance of every law that could ever be tested, right? When, in fact, on some exams, 8% of the score comes from material that could fit on 2 or 3 pages, right? 8% of the score is going to come from 4 elements. It's a pretty mind-blowing figure, right? When you think about the vastness of the test and 8% of it potentially coming from duty, breach, causation, damages, right? So all of this to say, number one, right, negligence is a topic we all want to have down really well when we show up into the bar exam, because it may be the single highest yielding of area of law that's actually tested on the exam. But more so than just thinking about negligence, that was an example, the bigger idea is you really want to prioritize your study time on areas of the test that yield the most points. Again, because it's all about this ratio, right? We want to get return on your investment of time. We want every minute that you spend preparing for the bar exam to result in point yield, right? And the better we can maximize that ratio, the higher your chance is of passing the bar exam. Right, so when you're thinking about prioritizing your study time, though, on areas of the test that yield the most points, it's obvious why, right? Because it's all about the ratio. The real question usually is, how do you do this, right? How do you prioritize your study time in the areas of law that yield the most points? Well, the good news here is it's mostly baked into your study schedule, right? We've accounted for this almost for you in our study schedule. If you just follow day by day what we tell you to do, right, guess in towards what amount of practice questions we're going to assign the most of, right? You're going to get the most amount of practice questions on negligence because we know it's the highest tested area of law. So we want you to do more practice questions in negligence than, say, intentional torts, right? Because that's a better maximization of your time in terms of point yield, right? Because we know there's more points in negligence than there are in intentional torts. So we want to prioritize your time on negligence, right? So if you simply follow the study schedule, it prioritizes your time very effectively. Right now, there's going to be time, though, right, where you're going to have passive review. That's up to you, how you want to spend that time, right? You know, sometimes we'll say, hey, look, you know, go over the italic outline, go over lectures, go over that passive review stuff. And we'll talk about passive review more in a second. And the good news here is, right, that's what the purpose of this is. All of you will have at least this document in PDF format included in your materials, right? This attack outline is 100% based on this idea of what we just talked about, right? About prioritization of study time on the areas of the test that yield the most points. This thing's actually got literally color-coded priority meters in it. Like, it tells you on every rule how high priority the rule is. It's all weighted for you, and it's all based on, you know, over 20 years of data, right? Analysis of all the data, looking at what's tested, what's not tested, analyzing it all out. It's all baked into this outline for you. So, you know, a lot of times that students ask, well, you know, how do I, Michael, how do I prioritize my study time really effectively? Well, number one, just follow the study schedule. A lot of it's baked in. Number two, if you are in your free time and you're wondering where to really focus, go to the attack outline. It's all laid out in color-coded priority meters for you. Super easy to follow, right? So when you're thinking about how do I really prioritize my study time, that's going to be the answer there. Which takes us to our last bit to really talk about here in terms of Studicata bar review, in terms of points, right? And the last idea here is, well, if we know, number one, the worst thing you can do is take a goose egg. So we want you to practice under bar exam conditions from day one, right? The worst thing you can do is accumulate no points. How do we avoid that? Well, we practice under bar exam conditions from day one, right? And then we know, okay, well, if that's point number one, what's the most obvious, you know, second part to that when we're thinking about the bar exam in terms of points? Well, you want to spend the majority of your study time on areas of the test that yield the most points, right? These are fairly obvious, right? The third one is a little bit more interesting, right? And at Studicata, this is a really big deal to us. And it's the idea that we recommend that you prioritize active review over passive review, right? Active review referring to actually completing practice questions under bar exam conditions and reviewing those practice questions critically, right? That we would say is active review. Passive review would refer to studying the outline or watching lectures or drilling flashcards, really anything that's not practicing bar exam questions under bar exam conditions and critically reviewing them. Right? We would categorize that type of study as passive review. So why do we really recommend, though, that you prioritize active review over passive review? Well, the first reason is it cuts out the middleman, right? Remember, if the bar exam is all about points, right? It's about accumulating points. It's about getting return on your time investment in terms of point yield on the bar exam, right? This is what it's all about. Well, the great thing about active review is that it actually cuts out the middleman, meaning, right, when you're studying this attack outline, right, you should view this as a middleman, right? In the attack outline, by the way, all of our passive review, the lectures, the outlines, I love all of this stuff. And I think it's very important in your mix, right? In your study mix, you need some passive review, right? The attack outline has its place, it has its purpose. The lectures have its place, its purpose. It's all there for a reason. We're talking about prioritization, right? Prioritizing active review over passive review. And the first reason is because it cuts out the middleman, right? Now, as good as this outline is, ultimately it's still a middleman. In order to get from this outline to point yield, points on the exam, it requires you to make another step, right? This outline doesn't necessarily tell you directly how to accumulate points on the bar exam. You have to take this outline and apply what you learn from it to bar exam fact patterns, right? You have to look in this and look at a rule in here and say, okay, this helps me clarify that point a little bit, but you have to then take that little bit that you learned, that nugget, and apply it to a fact pattern to actually accumulate points on the bar exam. So ultimately, this, even though it's a very helpful middleman, is nonetheless a middleman. It does not directly tell you how to accumulate points on the bar exam. Now, if you do multiple choice questions, license from the NCBE, or you do a practice essay that's we've licensed from the NCBE, or you sit down and you do it, and then you start to really review that essay, and you read all the explanations that the NCBE has given us. The National Conference of Bar Examiners literally tells us, hey, Studicata, here you go. This is what we were looking for on this essay. This is the 1998 July multi-state essay exam, torts. This is exactly point by point what we wanted to see. This is how a student accumulated points on the July 1998 MEE torts essay, right? And we have 20 years of this stuff that you're going to work through our program, right? And the great thing is the bar examiners themselves. It's not me, it's not Studicata, it's not anyone else. It's literally the people who will be grading you and assigning your points on the exam tell you, right, this is how you accumulated points on this fact pattern, right? There's no middleman there. They're saying directly, this is how we actually did it on this exam, right? So the best way to learn how to accumulate points is usually by going straight to the source, from the people who write the exam and administer the points. They actually tell us how you accumulate points, and they do it in no uncertain terms, right? They tell you line by line, this is what we were looking for. On the multiple choice portion, they explain why every single choice is correct or incorrect, right? The bar examiners themselves are coming up with all these breakdowns and explanations. So it's going to be very critical that we prioritize that type of review over reading an outline, right? Because again, reading an outline does require that step to be made to get from the outline to point accumulations, right? You're going to have to make some inferences, right? You're going to have to take that a step to apply what you learned to a fact pattern, where the fact pattern is more direct, right? And the beauty of doing it this way too is if you start with practice questions, right? Say your day is beginning, right? You're studying torts, right? To stay on theme here, you're going over torts. The better way to approach learning torts is, number one, to look at some fact patterns, right? Do an essay. See what a negligence fact pattern looks like. Do some multiple choice questions. See what the fact patterns look like. So now, right, and then you'll review those, see what it all is, see all the direct, how did you accumulate points on those fact patterns directly from the bar examiners. But now, if you have any questions left in torts, you're like, hey, I didn't understand this one thing fully, how proximate cause worked on this one fact pattern. I see what they're telling me here, but I don't fully get it. Then what do? You flip to the attack outline, you look at proximate cause, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. That really helps clarify that point for me. So then you are directly applying this outline to the fact patterns, right? It still cuts out the middleman. You're doing what is quote unquote passive review, right? Looking at an outline, but now you're doing it framed in the context of fact patterns. So it takes an activity that would normally be more passive review and directly applies it to fact patterns, which is why we say we reverse the traditional model, right? Other bar review courses are going to have you listen to lectures and read stuff first and then apply that to fact patterns. We say actually the better move is to do the fact patterns first, see what the fact patterns look like, get questions in your head queued up like, hey, how did this work? What was this? What was this? Build all of that so you're framed in the context of fact patterns, and then go watch the lectures and then go look at the materials, right? The study guides and the flashcards, right? So everything is used as a reference tool to fact patterns you've already looked at, right? Our opinion, that's going to be a way more effective use of your study time, right? In terms of point yield on the exam, right? Which is why, as the answer to all questions, it's all about the points. Why prioritize active review over passive review? It's all about the points, right? That's why. Now, some other ancillary notes to make here on active review over passive review, because obviously prioritizing active review over passive review is a really big deal to us at Studicata. It's kind of one of our taglines, right? The whole study less, practice more thing, right? It's all about prioritizing active review over passive review. Another great reason we love prioritizing active review over passive review that doesn't get talked about as much is because you, if you're watching this, I presume, are a human being, right? Unless Skynet has taken over and you're somehow a robot watching this, but I doubt that, right? Most of us watching this video right now are probably human beings, right? So what happens to human beings who read stuff, right? The most generalized comment of all time. What happens to human beings who read stuff? You ever sat down and tried to review an outline? What happens, right? Or if you get on the internet and you start watching video lectures, right? What's something that typically happens to human beings? It might not happen to a robot, right? When you're doing passive review, things like looking at an attack outline, reading an outline, or watching video lectures on the internet, right? What's very easy to happen here? Well, outside distractions, right? If you're reading an outline, it's very easy, very possible to read this outline while you're like laying in bed with the TV on, maybe someone's talking to you, you're on the computer, on Facebook and stuff. Right? It's easy to do passive review, right, without being 100% locked in. Like you can have an outline in front of you while you're, like getting ready in the morning, or you're at the gym, or like while you're doing other stuff. And I'm not saying that that's bad, right? You should try to study as much as you possibly can. So if you're getting in study time while you're doing other tasks, that's fine. But if you're doing it as your primary source of study, right, if you're prioritizing passive review over active review, right, what we feel like a lot of the other bar review companies do, especially in the beginning of the preparation, right, what happens to most human beings? Well, it's really easy to get distracted. Right, it's very easy to watch a video lecture on the internet, especially, right? Imagine you're going to sit down for the day and you're like, all right, I'm going to watch these torts lectures. Like, what is very easy to happen? If you're on the internet, you hear something in the torts lecture and then you have a question. So you pause the video, you pop open another tab, you go to Google something, but you see your Gmail account and you have an email from somebody. You're like, oh, let me check that, right? So you start reading that email. That reminds you of something else. Next thing you know, right, you're clicking around and you're just off. You've gotten away. You're distracted now, right? Or you pop something open to Google a question and then leads you to YouTube, right? And what happens on YouTube, right? YouTube is very good at distracting you, right? There'll be all those recommended videos with the thumbnails on the side that catch your eye, and you click on those and you start watching stuff. Next thing you know, you spend 3 hours watching cat videos on YouTube when you sat down to watch some tort lectures, right? Or Facebook, Instagram, they all are very good at distracting you because, right, these social media companies, just to give you, let anybody know that how this works if you don't know how these companies make billions of dollars, right? Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, how do they make all their money? Even Google, right? Advertisers pay them money. And why do advertisers pay money to Facebook and Google and YouTube and Instagram? Because they have our eyes, right? We spend all our time looking at Facebook and YouTube. We're watching it, right? So it is a huge incentive for a Facebook or an Instagram to distract you, right? They want your eyes on their platform for as much time as humanly possible, because the more hours you spend looking at their platform, that's more ads they can run, and the more ads they can run, right, the more money they make from the advertisers who are paying them money, right? That's why Facebook is free to use, right? You can sign up, make a free account for YouTube, Facebook, all this stuff, because they don't make money from that. They make money from the advertisers. So all that research and development that they pour in, it's all about keeping you distracted, right? So don't feel bad, right? And I do it too. Like, it's easy to get distracted on YouTube. You go and watch like one thing and then you're like 3 hours later, like, what happened? Why am I here? Right? That's all by design from, engineers who are getting paid, God knows how much money from these billion-dollar conglomerates, right? So point number 2, you're a human being. It's very easy to get distracted when you're looking at an outline or watching lectures. But you know what? If you're doing active review, you're usually more locked in. When you're sitting there under bar exam conditions, you see a timer in front of you and you've sat down to actually work through practice questions, it's much more difficult to get distracted by the outside noise when you're sitting there under a timer doing practice questions. Usually you're way more locked in, which is going to make that active review actually much higher quality a lot of the time than passive review, just solely because you're a human being and it's very easy for us to get distracted. Right? Finally, another point to make about active review over passive review, right? You should prioritize, or why we recommend prioritizing active review over passive review, because generally active review is the best way to beat bar exam stress and anxiety, right? If you're like me and you're a big time perfectionist and you get very stressed out about big events coming up, right? Very anxious, very nervous, very stressed out, right? Then probably one of the best things that you can actually do, and people don't realize this, to really beat that anxiety and stress, whatever it is, right? Say you have a wedding coming up and you're the best man, right? This happened to me a few times. Best man's got to make the speech at the wedding, right? Not my favorite thing to do, right? It's very easy to talk in an empty room to a camera. You throw in a lot of emotion and like 200 people in the room, becomes a little bit more difficult, right? So what I found though, that the best thing to do there is actually just to sit there and practice it, right? If you sit down in front of a mirror or with a buddy or something and work through your speech or your toast, right, over and over again, we actually get there and it's time to give your toast and you've given it a few dozen times or whatever in practice. It's actually not bad at all. It's how I've delivered some killer best man speeches, right? It's all about repetition and practice. That's how you're going to beat the stress and anxiety of any big event coming up that makes you nervous. So the bar exam's no different, right? One of the best ways to beat bar exam stress and anxiety is to sit there under bar exam conditions, simulate the exam as much as possible, and practice, right? If you do this repetitively, right, every single day, you're waking up and you're doing practice questions under bar exam conditions. You do this for 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, however long you're doing it. What's going to happen when you show up to the bar exam? All right, this is going to feel like another day at the park. This is another day at the office. You've been doing this for weeks, right? You're a machine. You're very used to doing bar exam questions under bar exam conditions. Now, everyone's going to have jitters, right? If you have a pulse, right? If you don't have jitters, right, I'd be more concerned, right? Everyone's going to be a little bit nervous. That's fine, right? A little bit of stress is great. It's going to heighten all your senses. You know, a little bit of stress can be beneficial. It's going to make you feel more awake, more focused. That's all great. Jitters are fine. You want jitters before the exam. You just don't want that level of panic where now you can't even think, you can't even do anything because you're just so wound up, you're panicking, right? So the way to avoid that, again, the best way, right, and there's a ton of techniques, and we'll talk about this in other videos, but one of the best things that you can do is actually active review, sitting there and demystifying the process. So there's nothing to be afraid of on the actual exam. You've done this. You've done it all over and over. You're just going to feel better walking into the exam. Right, so the last thing I'll leave it on here is the big objection, right? Because I've been doing this for a long time. I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. There's a huge objection to prioritizing active review over passive review, and that is, but Michael, I don't know the law well enough to sit down and answer practice questions under bar exam conditions, right? I need to watch some lectures, or I need to go through your outline. I need to do this, I need to do that before I can actually sit down and answer practice questions. And my response to that is always, well, why? Why? You know, who cares? If you get every single practice question wrong, doesn't matter, right? It's practice, right? And again, the best way to learn, you know, that's fine. I don't expect anyone to know the law well enough. If you knew the law well enough to answer the practice questions, what are we even here for, right? The whole point of this is to learn, to get better. I want you to make as many mistakes as possible during practice. Every mistake you make now during practice is one less mistake you're going to make on the actual bar exam. Right? Remember, it's all about time versus point yield. You know, and the best way to get return on that time is not looking at an attack outline. It's not listening to me give lectures. It's to start. And again, those can be very beneficial. But once you've seen some fact patterns, you need to see fact patterns to even know what your questions are. Right? Because what if you sit down and you think you don't know the law well enough to answer practice questions and then you crush it? Right? Well, then it'd be a really big waste of time to watch 8 hours of torts lectures. If you just sit down and you knock out 50 torts questions and you get 100% of them right, you don't need to spend time watching torts lectures, right? That would be a very low ROI on your time, right? Which is another big reason we really like prioritizing active review over passive review. It's going to tell you where you need to spend your time, right? The other bar review companies, you know, generally are making more one-size-fits-all programs. And they want you to sit down and watch 8 hours of lecture minimum in each subject, no matter what. Even if you're the world's foremost expert in contract law and you sign up for the traditional bar review programs, they're going to assign you 8 hours of contract law lectures to watch, because that's just, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Where we're saying, hey, do the practice questions first. See if you need any clarifications. Maybe you don't, maybe you do. And then we have enough time. If you need clarifications, great. Go in and watch all the torts lectures. Go in and watch all the contracts lectures. That's fine. But the key is everybody's different. And you can base the direction that you go, you can base your passive review, right, the outlines and the watching lectures on areas that you actually need to, right, so that you're getting the highest ROI on your time as possible. Right, we really want you to get that return of point yield for every minute you spend studying. So if you're watching 8 hours of tort lectures and you don't need to watch any of that, that was a waste of 8 hours. That's horrible for this formula, right? We don't want that ever. Right? If you can get 100% of your torts questions correct without watching a lecture, why watch lectures in torts, right? It's a waste of your time. Right? Don't want that. So this response, though, I don't know the law well enough to answer practice questions. Don't worry. Don't worry. No one does. Who cares, right? Even I'll miss some practice questions, right? Now, no one's going to walk into the bar exam and get a perfect score, right? Don't worry about that at all. You're going to learn by doing, right? You're going to learn by sitting there and going through the answer explanations. We're never going to assign you a practice question that doesn't include a detailed answer explanation. So the beauty is, great, you don't know something, you can read the explanation when you're done, right? No problem. So don't worry about that too much. And really, that's the last point I want to make about active review. Right, we're thinking about prioritizing active review over passive review. And we're going to get into this in a lot more detail in our next video, but just to help segue to our next video a little bit, right, when we say active review, it is important to note, because I see this a lot from students, simply completing a practice question in of itself does nothing, right? If you did every single practice question, you completed every practice question that the bar examiners have ever released, and you did them all 100 times over, right? If you never reviewed any of those practice questions, that was 100% a waste of your time, right? If you're not ripping apart all the questions, analyzing them, really trying to understand why each answer choice is correct or incorrect, and on the essays, really making sure that you're confident you know how all the law was applied to the fact pattern, right? You're doing yourself a huge disservice. The whole way that this works, when we say prioritize active review, the only way Studicata bar review works is if you actually sit there and critically review each question. Right? If you're completing a bunch of questions but you're not reviewing them, it does nobody any good, right? Your gains, where all of that point yield is going to come from, is the time that you spend, right, studying the answer explanations, ripping apart the questions, wrestling with the questions, really trying to understand what you got wrong, what you got right. All of that is where you're going to get the highest ROI on your time. It's not doing the practice questions themselves, it's the review process. But we'll get into that in way more detail in our next video. But until then, guys, I do wish you all the absolute best, and I'll see you at our next video.